All right, everyone, get ready for a deep dive today into risk management.
Mm.
Well, not just any risk management. We're talking about the oh-so-popular risk-based approach.
That's familiar, right?
Definitely, like it's everywhere, but is it just a fancy phrase?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to find out. We've got this super interesting episode from the Compliance Officer's Playbook called, get this, Applying a Risk-Based Approach More Than Just a Buzzword. We're going past the buzzwords, the jargon, and figuring out how this approach really works. And spoiler alert, it's more complicated than you might think. Even pros, people who do this every day, sometimes, they don't get it quite right.
It's true.
So why is this whole risk-based approach such a big deal anyway? Like, why should anyone listening really care?
Okay, so imagine this. We all have limits, right? Time, money, energy. A risk-based approach, well, it helps you decide where to use those things, where to really focus for the biggest impact. It's not about getting rid of every single risk, but about figuring out which ones are the really big problems.
The ones that'll keep you up at night.
Exactly. And which ones, well, you can handle a little more easily.
Okay, yeah, the prioritize thing, I get that. But honestly, every time I hear risk-based approach, it's kind of like my brain just shuts off. It's so vague.
I know what you mean.
So can you, explain it in a way that makes sense for someone who, maybe hasn't been doing compliance forever?
Absolutely. So at its heart, it's all about making smart decisions about risk. Think about it. You probably already do this all the time without even realizing it. Like, imagine you're crossing a street, a busy one. You don't just walk out there without looking.
Hopefully not.
You check both ways, see how fast the cars are going, then decide when it's safe to cross. That's kind of what we're talking about here, but, well, with business stuff.
Makes sense. So it's about, thinking things through when it comes to risk, not just reacting to whatever happens. Okay, I'm with you so far.
Yeah.
But the podcast, it talks about this 4-step framework, and, well, frameworks always make me want to grab another coffee.
Fair enough.
Can you break those steps down for me? Make them a little less frameworky.
Okay, let's pretend we're detectives for a minute.
All right, I'm intrigued.
So step one is finding clues. You gotta identify the risks. This can be tricky, though. Some risks, they're obvious, like outdated software that hackers could get into. But others, they're harder to spot, like new financial crimes or regulations in countries you don't know much about. You gotta be proactive, do your research, understand your business, and, well, the whole world around it.
No blinders allowed. Got it. Okay, so we've gathered our clues, like a good detective. What's next?
Now it's time to analyze those clues and decide what to do, just like our detective. We've got the risks, now how do we deal with them? Do we try to avoid them altogether, like, say, not doing business in a risky country? Or maybe accept the risk if it's not a big deal, or try to make it less risky, put some safeguards in place, like really strong cybersecurity.
So it's weighing the pros and cons, right? What could happen versus how much it costs to do something about it. But that's where things can get tough, right? What if you just don't have all the information you need to make those decisions?
You hit the nail on the head. That's a big challenge the podcast talks about. Not having enough data, that's a huge obstacle. Like our detective trying to solve a case without enough evidence, it's almost impossible to make good decisions. And that's why things like these things called risk and control self-assessments, RCSAs for short, and financial crime risk assessments, FCRAs, those are super important.
Hold on, RCSAs, FCRAs. Our listeners might not know what those are. Could you quickly explain?
Of course. So RCSAs are like a system for organizations, for companies to look at their own processes, the things they do every day, and find potential risks. Then they check if they have good controls in place to handle those risks. And FCRAs, they're similar, but they focus specifically on the risk of, well, financial crimes like money laundering or fraud.
So, are they vulnerable to those things?
Right. And these assessments, they help them find those weak spots and take steps to stop those crimes from happening.
Got it. So these assessments are like our detectives' tools for gathering evidence, helping them build the solid case. But let's be honest, sometimes there's pressure to just accept certain risks. Maybe it's easier or cheaper that way, at least in the short term.
It happens all the time.
So how does this risk-based approach deal with that?
That's a real problem, and that's where the approach can be misused. Sometimes companies might try to downplay certain risks or avoid those expensive controls, especially if they're focused on making a quick profit instead of thinking about the long term.
Short-sighted, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. And that can lead to this check-the-box mentality where they go through the motions of, doing the risk assessment but don't really understand or fix the underlying issues. Having a strong culture of risk management within the organization is key here.
It's like just saying you've accepted a risk without really doing the work to, like, back up that decision or put in safeguards. Isn't that kind of, uh, well, abusing the whole idea of this approach?
100%. If you just label something an accepted risk without documenting it, analyzing it, and putting in the work to mitigate it, you're not really managing risk. It's like saying you've accepted the risk of your house burning down, but you don't have insurance or even a fire extinguisher. You might know the risk is there, but you haven't done anything to actually handle it responsibly. That's why this next step in the framework is so important, documenting your decisions and getting them approved.
Documenting decisions. Sounds a bit boring, maybe, but I can see why it's important. Like, it's proof that you've thought things through. But why the need for approvals?
It's about accountability and transparency, making sure decisions about risk are looked at and agreed upon by people with the right expertise. It prevents, those rogue decisions or actions that could put the company at risk.
So having those good records, that paper trail, it's your best defense if someone questions your decisions later on.
Absolutely.
All right, so what about the last step in this framework? What's number 4?
It's monitoring and reporting, and this is where things get really dynamic. Remember that busy street we talked about?
Yeah, the one with all the cars?
Right. You wouldn't just check for traffic once and then assume it's safe to cross forever, would you? You
Right.
keep checking, looking for changes, anything that might make you change your mind. Managing risk is like that too.
So it's not a one-and-done thing. We're always checking, making sure our decisions still make sense, and, well, changing things up if we need to. How often should we be doing that checking? Is it like every day, every month?
It depends on the risk, really, how serious it is. Some risks you might need to check every day or every week, others maybe once a month or every few months. The main thing is having a system to stay informed and make changes when you need to. It's kind of like checking the weather before a trip. You might check every day before you go, but then, well, only now and then while you're actually on the trip.
Makes sense. So the risk-based approach, it's all about being flexible,
Right.
right? Adapting, not just following some rigid rule book.
You got it.
But doesn't that create a challenge? How do you balance that need to adapt, to change, with the need for clear, consistent standards? Doesn't that seem kind of contradictory?
That's a great question, and it's something we'll get into more in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
We're back. So we've talked about the framework, the challenges, even how important it is to be flexible. But, like, how does this risk-based approach actually work in the real world? Got any concrete examples?
Definitely. The podcast, it has some really interesting ones. Remember how we were talking about adapting to new situations? Well, new regulations, they're a perfect example of that.
Oh, right. They mentioned GDPR and those Russian sanctions. Now that you mention it, it seems obvious, but I hadn't really thought of regulations as a reason to, like, go back and look at your risk assessments again.
It's a big one. Think about GDPR. It wasn't just another box to check. It made companies all over the world rethink how they handle personal data. Like all of a sudden, data breaches weren't just an IT problem anymore. They became a big compliance issue, a reputational risk. A risk-based approach would say, hold on, this new regulation, it just made the impact of a data breach much bigger. We need to change our priorities and resources.
So maybe you spend more on cybersecurity, update your privacy policies, train your employees better on data protection, all because the risk of a data breach just went way up.
Exactly. And it's not just about reacting to regulations either. It's about being ready for them. A smart company using a risk-based approach, they'd be keeping an eye on what's happening with regulations, trying to see how they might be affected, like thinking ahead. Exactly. Thinking, what if a GDPR-like regulation comes to our industry next? Are we ready? What would it mean for us?
Now that's planning. It's not just about playing defense, it's about being proactive, anticipating future risks. But how do you even start to think about something that hasn't even happened yet? Sounds like trying to predict the future.
It's not about having a crystal ball, It's more about understanding where things are going. Are there any, new technologies or trends that could create new risks? Are there any political or social changes that might affect your business? By staying informed, asking the right questions, you can get a better idea of what might be coming.
Okay, so it's about seeing the bigger picture, not just focusing on the immediate threats. Got it. But let's get back to those specific examples for a second. What about the sanctions? I remember that was a pretty big deal when it happened.
Oh yeah, for sure. When things change drastically, like with those Russian sanctions, companies need to quickly figure out how they're exposed. The risk-based approach, it helps them prioritize those questions, and figure out where to put their resources to deal with the most urgent stuff.
So it's like a triage system, but for businesses, helping you see which risks need immediate attention. That makes sense for a crisis. But what about those regular risk assessments we talked about, the RCSAs and FCRAs? Those can feel like just another compliance task. How can we make them more, I guess, more valuable, more in line with this whole risk-based approach?
That's the key, isn't it? It's not just about going through the motions. A real risk-based RCSA, it would mean really digging deep into your processes, finding those weaknesses and vulnerabilities. It's about asking those tough questions. What could go wrong? What would happen if it did? Are the controls we have good enough, or do we need to do more?
Like, it's like a detective at a crime scene, right?
Hmm.
Looking for clues, trying to figure out what happened.
Yeah.
But instead of solving a crime that already happened, we're trying to prevent future ones. Pretty cool.
Right. And the same goes for FCRAs. It's not about checking boxes and saying, yep, we assess the risk of money laundering. It's about really understanding your exposure to financial crime. What specific activities are the riskiest, and then tailoring your controls to address those.
So it's about being specific, not just generic, adapting your approach to your company's own unique risks. So the risk-based approach, it's all about customization then. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
That's a great point. It's about recognizing that every company is different. Every industry has its own risks. Even within the same company, different departments or processes will have different levels of risk. You can't just use the same approach for everything. You need to tailor your strategy, your risk management strategy to the specific situation.
Makes sense, right? It does. It really does. But let's go back to something we were talking about before, the tension between being flexible and being consistent. You left us hanging there at the end of the last part. So how do you balance those two things, the need to adapt to changing risks, but also have clear, consistent standards? How do you do both?
It's a challenge, that's for sure. Too much flexibility, well, that can lead to chaos, everyone doing their own thing. But being too rigid, too strict, well, that can make you slow, unable to react to new threats. It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot, and, well, it's not always easy.
It sounds, well, a bit tricky, like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. How can you be both flexible and consistent at the same time?
Think about like your own routines, and flexibility is good, but you also need consistency to stay on track, right? In a risk-based approach, it means having a clear system for making decisions, a set of principles that guide your actions, even as the specific risks you're dealing with change.
So it's like having a compass, right, to guide you, even when you're in uncharted territory. You need that sense of direction. But what does that actually look like in real life? Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's say your company has a policy, a rule that everyone has to use strong passwords. That's a consistent standard. But what makes a strong password, well, that might change as technology changes, as hackers get more sophisticated. So you might need to update your password rules every so often to stay ahead of the game. You're being flexible in how you adapt to those new threats, but you're still consistent because you're sticking to the idea of strong passwords.
Okay, so you're adapting the specifics, but staying true to the big picture. It's like having a solid foundation, but you're willing to remodel the house if you need to.
Exactly. And that's what makes the risk-based approach so powerful. It's not just a static set of rules. It's a way of thinking that lets you adjust to changing circumstances while still focusing on what's important, managing risk effectively.
This is really starting to make sense. It's not just a buzzword. It's this dynamic, always evolving process. You need to be thoughtful, constantly adapting, and really committed to managing risk well. But I got to be honest, I'm still kind of stuck on this idea of applying risk-based thinking to, like, our personal lives. Can we talk about that a bit more before we finish up?
Absolutely. I think that's a perfect way to wrap up our deep dive.
Okay, last part of our deep dive. We've talked about a lot, but I'm really curious about this idea of, like, using risk-based thinking in our everyday lives. It's kind of crazy to think about.
It is pretty wild when you think about it. We've been focusing on risk in business, but a lot of these ideas, they work really well for making personal decisions, too. It's almost like discovering a secret to making better choices.
Ooh, a secret code. Let's crack it. So where do we even start with this risk-based thinking outside of work? Do I, like, need to do a risk assessment for my grocery shopping now?
Maybe not the grocery list, but think about how we use our time and energy. We all have limits, right? Time, money, focus. A risk-based approach, it would say, okay, what are the things that really matter for my happiness, my goals, my well-being? Am I using my time and energy on those things?
So it's like taking stock, figuring out what's truly important, and then making sure, well, that my actions match those priorities. But how do we figure out what those high-impact areas are? It seems a little abstract.
It's all about asking yourself some tough questions. What are the things that, if they went wrong, would really mess things up in your life? It could be your health, your relationships, your job, your money. Once you figure out those key areas, you can start thinking about the risks, the things that could cause problems in each of those areas.
Okay, I'm starting to see it. It's like creating a personal risk assessment,
Hmm.
identifying those things that matter most, the areas where if things went wrong, it would have like the biggest negative consequences.
Yeah.
And then we focus our energy there.
You got it. Imagine someone who, wants to start their own business but spends all their free time watching TV. A risk-based approach would say, hold on, that free time is valuable. Are you using it in a way that helps you reach your goals? Maybe they could be taking online classes, meeting other entrepreneurs, or, actually working on their business plan.
Or maybe someone who's terrified of public speaking, but knows that, well, if they got good at it, it would open so many doors for them in their career. I know a few people like that.
That's a perfect example. They're avoiding the risk of being uncomfortable or, feeling embarrassed, but by doing that, they might be missing out on even bigger rewards. A risk-based approach would say, hey, carefully think about the good and the bad, the potential costs and benefits, and then make a smart decision.
So it's not about being reckless or taking crazy risks. It's about strategy, making thoughtful decisions based on what's really important to us. It seems like this could really help people break out of those fear-based patterns that hold them back.
Exactly. It's about understanding that risk is a part of life. We can't avoid it, but we can choose how we deal with it. We can be reactive, letting fear control our choices, or we can be proactive, using a risk-based approach to make those choices with more purpose and awareness.
That's a great way to put it. It's like taking control instead of just letting life happen to you.
Yeah.
But it's easy to focus on those big decisions, the life-changing ones. Can we use this approach for, well, those smaller everyday choices too?
Absolutely. Think about something as simple as, I don't know, deciding whether to bike to work.
Okay, let's break that down. How would a risk-based approach help with that? Seems pretty straightforward.
Well, it might seem simple, but there are always risks, even in those everyday things. You'd start by identifying them, what could go wrong, maybe traffic accidents, bad weather, problems with the bike.
Then I think about how likely those risks are. How much traffic is there?
Yeah.
What's the weather forecast? How reliable is my bike? I'm starting to see the pattern here.
You got it. And then, this is the most important part, you think about the impact of those risks. What if you get a flat tire? Just a little annoying, right? But what about an accident? That could be a serious injury.
So I'm weighing the pros and cons, the good stuff about biking exercise, fresh air, saving money on gas, against the potential downsides. Then I make my decision based on all of that. Maybe I decide to bike on less busy roads, wear a helmet, and make sure my bike is in good shape. So you're not eliminating the risk entirely, but you're doing things to make it less risky.
Perfect. You just used a risk-based approach for your bike ride to work. And you can use the same way of thinking for tons of everyday decisions.
This is really eye-opening. It's like having this mental tool to help me make better, more thoughtful decisions in every part of my life.
That's exactly what it is. The risk-based approach isn't just for businesses. It's a way of thinking that can help us all deal with life's complexities, with more clarity and confidence. It can even make those everyday choices a bit more, a bit more interesting.
This whole conversation has really changed how I think about things. Now I see risk as something to understand and manage, not something to be afraid of. It's actually pretty empowering.
I agree. And remember, it's all about making informed choices, but information changes all the time, right? What was a safe bet yesterday might be risky tomorrow. That's why it's so important to stay curious and keep learning.
So stay curious, stay informed, and don't be afraid to, reassess things as you learn more. That's how we really embrace this way of thinking. It's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive for today.
Wow, this has been amazing. We went from this corporate buzzword to a whole philosophy about life. Who knew risk management could be so interesting?
It's all about how you look at it. And I think we've shown that the risk-based approach is more than just rules. It's a mindset that can help us navigate life, with more intention and awareness.
Absolutely. We talked about its applications, the challenges, and how it can change not just how companies work, but how we live our lives.
Yeah.
It's been quite a journey.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the world with open minds and, well, a healthy dose of risk-based thinking.
And remember, don't be afraid to take some calculated risks along the way. See you next time.